poor girl, a wicked stepmother, and a glass slipper that changes everything. You think you know the story of Cinderella? The ultimate rags-to-riches fairy tale about dreams coming true? But what if I told you that this beloved Disney classic was based on something far darker? Because once you learn the truth about Cinderella, the truth that Disney will never tell you, you'll realize you've been watching a sanitized version of one of history's most disturbing documentaries about human trafficking and domestic servitude. The real Cinderella wasn't waiting for her dreams to come true. She was fighting for her very survival in a world where girls like her were bought, sold, and worked to death. Welcome back, Darklings. Before we uncover the horrifying truth, let's start with the version you think you know. Once upon a time, there lived a kind and beautiful girl whose mother died when she was young. Her father remarried a woman with 2 daughters of her own, and when he died, Cinderella found herself at the mercy of her cruel step-family. They forced her to cook, clean, and serve them while they lived in luxury. She slept by the fireplace, covered in cinders and ash, which is how she got her name. One day, the king announced a grand ball where the prince would choose his bride. Cinderella's stepsisters prepared for weeks, but she was forbidden to go. As she wept by the fireplace, her fairy godmother appeared and transformed her with magic, turning a pumpkin into a carriage, mice into horses, and her rags into a beautiful gown and glass slippers. But the magic would only last until midnight. At the ball, the prince was enchanted by the mysterious princess and danced with her all evening. But as midnight approached, Cinderella fled, losing one glass slipper on the palace steps. The prince searched the kingdom, trying the slipper on every maiden until he found Cinderella. The shoe fit perfectly. They married and lived happily ever after. It's the quintessential fairy tale. The triumph of goodness over evil, the reward for patience and kindness, the promise that dreams really can come true. But this Disney version you just heard isn't the original story. It's not even close. And the real versions, the ones that Disney desperately hopes you'll never read, reveal a truth so disturbing that it will change how you see this tale forever. The earliest printed version we have in the West comes from the brothers Grimm in 1812. And it reads like a horror story. In their version, there is no fairy godmother. Instead, Cinderella plants a hazel tree on her mother's grave and waters it with her tears. A white bird that represents her mother's spirit brings her golden dresses and silver slippers for the ball. But the truly shocking part comes when the prince tries to find the mystery princess. When he arrives at Cinderella's house with the golden slipper, the eldest stepsister tries it on first. But her foot is too big. So her mother hands her a knife and tells her to cut off her toe. "When you are queen, you won't need to walk," she says. The girl cuts off her toe, forces her foot into the bloody slipper, and rides away with the prince. But as they pass by Cinderella's mother's grave, 2 white doves cry out, turn and peek, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe is too small. The true bride waits for you." The prince looks down and sees blood streaming from the slipper. He returns the false bride and asks for the other sister. The second stepsister tries on the slipper, but her foot is also too big. So she cuts off her heel and jams her mutilated foot into the bloody shoe. Again, she rides away with the prince, and again the doves warn him about the blood. Only then does he ask for Cinderella, whose foot fits perfectly without any mutilation. At the wedding, the 2 stepsisters try to ingratiate themselves with the new princess, walking on either side of her. But the doves, seeking justice for their years of cruelty to Cinderella, swoop down and peck out their eyes. First the left eye from one sister, then the right eye from the other. The story ends with the stepsisters, blind and crippled, condemned to live as beggars for the rest of their lives. No magic, no forgiveness, just blood, mutilation, and brutal justice. But even the Grimm version isn't the beginning of this story. Recent research has revealed that Cinderella belongs to one of the most ancient and widespread folktale patterns in human history. Folklorists classify it as a TU510A, and versions of this story have been found on every continent inhabited by humans. In 2016, researchers studying the evolution of folktales discovered that the Cinderella story pattern could be traced back over 4,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously told stories in human history. But here's what makes this discovery so disturbing. The earliest versions weren't fantasy stories. They were based on real social conditions that existed across ancient civilizations. Conditions that were so common, so accepted, that people told stories about them to their children. Because the truth is, the original Cinderella stories weren't about magic or dreams coming true. They were about domestic slavery. They were about orphan children sold into servitude. They were about a brutal economic system where young girls could be bought, owned, and worked to death, with their only hope of escape being the incredibly rare chance that someone with power might notice them. Archaeological evidence supports this horrifying interpretation. Across ancient civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, China, archaeologists have found burial sites that reveal the stark reality of domestic slavery. In elite tombs, they've discovered the remains of young servants buried alive with their masters, presumably to continue serving them in the afterlife. The skeletons of these servants show evidence of malnutrition, bone deformities from heavy labor starting in childhood, and injuries consistent with physical abuse. In ancient Egypt, wall paintings and tombs show domestic servants performing the exact tasks that Cinderella does in the stories: sweeping, cooking, serving food, tending fires. These weren't hired employees, they were property. Archaeological evidence from sites across the ancient world reveals workshops where children as young as 5 were forced to work in pottery production, textile manufacturing, and food preparation. Exactly the kind of labor that defines Cinderella's daily existence. But perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from the discovery of what archaeologists call differential burial practices. In ancient cemeteries across multiple civilizations, they've found clear hierarchies in how the dead were treated. Elite individuals were buried with elaborate grave goods, precious metals, and careful preparation of the body. But scattered around these elite burials are much simpler graves, often just bodies wrapped in cloth, and thrown into pits, with evidence suggesting these individuals died young and lived lives of physical hardship. Analysis of these remains reveals that many of these individuals, particularly young women, showed signs of chronic malnutrition, stunted growth, and bone damage consistent with carrying heavy loads and performing repetitive manual labor from childhood. In other words, the archaeological record confirms that the conditions described in Cinderella stories, orphan children forced into domestic servitude, worked to near death, treated as property rather than people, weren't fantasy. They were everyday reality for millions of children across ancient civilizations. The oldest written version of a Cinderella-type story that we have comes from China in 860 CE, in a collection called Miscellaneous Morsels from Yayang. The story is called The Shun, and it's far more explicit about the social realities it depicts. The Shun is described as the daughter of a cave chief who dies, leaving her at the mercy of her stepmother. But unlike the Disney version, there's no ambiguity about her status. She is explicitly described as a slave, forced to perform dangerous tasks like gathering firewood in dangerous mountain areas, where she could easily be killed by wild animals. The Chinese version is also more explicit about the role of supernatural intervention. The Xian is helped not by a fairy godmother, but by the spirit of a magical fish that she had befriended and that her stepmother had killed and eaten. This detail is crucial because in ancient Chinese belief systems, ancestral spirits were believed to watch over their descendants and occasionally intervene to help them. The story isn't about magic in the Disney sense. It's about the hope that the dead might somehow reach across the veil to help their living family members escape impossible situations. Even more revealing is how the transformation works in the Chinese version. The Shan doesn't just get beautiful clothes and slippers. She receives specific markers of high social status that would have been immediately recognizable to ancient Chinese audiences. The golden shoes, in particular, weren't just pretty footwear. In ancient China, foot size and the ability to wear delicate shoes were indicators of social class. Only wealthy women who never had to do manual labor could maintain the small, soft feet that fit into such shoes. But here is where the story becomes even more disturbing. The prince in the Chinese version doesn't fall in love with the Shan's personality or even her beauty. He becomes obsessed with finding the owner of the tiny golden shoe, because its size indicates that she comes from the highest social class. The story is explicit about this. He's not looking for true love. He's looking for a woman whose foot size proves her aristocratic breeding. This detail reveals something crucial about what these ancient stories were really about. They weren't romantic fantasies. They were stories about a social system where a person's worth was determined by physical markers of class, where marriage was a business transaction, and where the only way for someone from the lowest social class to improve their situation was through an almost impossibly rare stroke of luck. The more versions of this story we examine from around the world, the clearer it becomes that Cinderella isn't a fairy tale at all. It's a historical document, and the history it documents is one of the darkest chapters in human civilization. The systematic enslavement and exploitation of children, particularly girls, across virtually every ancient society. In ancient Greece, these children were called oikots, household slaves, who were often orphans or children sold by desperately poor families. The Greek historian Xenophon wrote detailed descriptions of how these domestic slaves were trained, worked, and treated. Young girls were specifically prized for household work because they could be more easily controlled and were less likely to rebel or run away. The archaeological evidence backs this up. Skeletal remains of young domestic slaves in ancient Greek sites show evidence of malnutrition and overwork. With many dying before reaching adulthood, in Rome, the situation was even more systematized. Roman law explicitly defined different categories of domestic slaves, with specific legal frameworks for their purchase, treatment, and disposal. Young female slaves, called ancilla, were particularly valuable for household work. Roman writings describe training programs where these children were taught cooking, cleaning, weaving, and other domestic skills from as young as age 5. The lucky few who showed exceptional skill or beauty might eventually earn their freedom or be adopted into the family they served. But this was so rare that it was considered worthy of recording in historical documents. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the evidence from ancient Egypt. Papyrus documents from the New Kingdom period describe a thriving market in orphan children, who were sold specifically for domestic labor. These documents reveal that young girls were particularly sought after because they could be trained to perform the complex household management tasks required in elite Egyptian homes. The papyrus records even include specific prices for children of different ages and skills, treating them as literal commodities. But the Egyptian evidence also reveals something else: the origins of some of the most iconic elements of the Cinderella story. In ancient Egyptian households, lowest-ranking domestic slaves were responsible for tending the fires and cleaning out the ash from cooking hearths and religious braziers. This was considered the most degrading work because it left the person constantly covered in soot and ash. Sound familiar? The Egyptian evidence also explains the significance of shoes in the Cinderella story. In ancient Egypt, footwear was a crucial marker of social status. Slaves typically went barefoot or wore simple reed sandals. Free persons wore leather sandals. But only the elite could afford the delicate decorated slippers made from precious materials. The condition of a person's feet, whether they were calloused and damaged from going barefoot, or soft and clean from wearing shoes, immediately revealed their social class to anyone who saw them. This explains why the shoe test in Cinderella stories was so significant to ancient audiences. It was unjust about finding someone whose foot was the right size. It was about finding someone whose feet revealed their true social status. Cinderella's feet, despite her servitude, remained undamaged because she was originally from a higher class before being reduced to slavery. The shoe test was literally a test of her genetic and social authenticity. The global distribution of Cinderella-type stories reveals just how widespread these conditions were. In sub-Saharan Africa, versions of the story appear in cultures that had no contact with European or Asian storytelling traditions. The African versions are often even more explicit about the realities of domestic slavery. In many of these stories, the Cinderella figure is explicitly described as having been captured in war or sold by her family during times of famine. Native American cultures also have versions of the Cinderella story that predate European contact. In these versions, the protagonist is often from a defeated tribe, who has been taken as a slave by the victorious group. The transformation in these stories is unmagical. It's described as the result of intervention by tribal spirits, who take pity on the girl's suffering and arrange for her to be adopted into a higher status family. What's particularly revealing about the Native American versions is how they handle the element of violence that appears in many Cinderella stories. In several versions, the stepfamily faces brutal punishment not just for their cruelty to the protagonist, but specifically for their violation of tribal customs regarding the treatment of captives and slaves. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were educational tools that taught listeners about the social and spiritual consequences of treating even the most powerless members of society with excessive cruelty. The pattern is consistent across cultures and continents. The Cinderella story serves as both a documentation of widespread systems of domestic slavery and as a rare example of someone escaping those systems. But here's what makes this pattern so disturbing. In every version, escape from slavery depends not on the protagonist's own actions, skills, or rebellion, but on the intervention of supernatural forces or the arbitrary favor of someone with power. This reveals something crucial about how these ancient societies viewed the systems of exploitation they had created. They didn't see domestic slavery as something that could or should be abolished through human action. Instead, they saw it as a natural condition that could only be escaped through divine intervention or extraordinary luck. The Cinderella stories were unencouraging social change. They were providing psychological comfort to people trapped in brutal systems by offering the fantasy that supernatural forces might occasionally rescue someone deserving. Modern anthropologists have identified this pattern in oppressed communities throughout history. When people are trapped in systems they cannot change through their own actions, they often develop stories and beliefs that provide hope through the possibility of external intervention, whether from gods, spirits, or powerful patrons. The Cinderella stories served exactly this function for the millions of children trapped in domestic slavery across ancient civilizations. But the story's evolution over time reveals how these brutal realities were gradually obscured and romanticized. As societies became more sensitive to the horrors of slavery, the explicit references to buying, selling, and owning children were removed from the stories. The supernatural elements were enhanced to make the escape seem more magical and less dependent on random luck. And most importantly, the focus shifted from survival and escape from slavery to romance and personal fulfillment. This transformation accelerated during the Christian era, when church authorities deliberately modified many folk stories to make them more compatible with Christian moral teachings. The brutal punishments that befell Cinderella's tormentors in early versions were softened or removed entirely. In line with Christian emphasis on forgiveness, the magical elements were reframed as divine intervention rather than pagan spirit activity. And the social critique implicit in stories about slavery and exploitation was replaced with moral lessons about patience, humility, and trusting in God's plan. By the time Charles Perrault published his version in 1697, the story had been transformed into something much closer to what we recognize today. Perrault, writing for the French aristocracy, emphasized the elements of social advancement and luxury that would appeal to his audience. He introduced the fairy godmother as a more palatable substitute for the ancestral spirits or pagan deities that appeared in earlier versions. Most significantly, he added the famous glass slippers, a detail that removed the story even further from the grim realities of ancient domestic slavery. The glass slippers are particularly significant because they represent something that could never exist in reality. Unlike the golden shoes or delicate leather slippers of earlier versions, glass slippers serve no practical purpose. They exist purely as fantasy objects, symbols of a transformation so complete that it transcends the physical laws of the real world. By introducing this impossibly fragile and impractical footwear, Perrault was signaling to his audience that this story was now pure fantasy, completely disconnected from any real social conditions. But even Perrault's sanitized version retained enough disturbing elements that later editors felt compelled to modify it further. The brothers Grimm, despite being more willing than Perrault to include violent elements, still removed many of the most explicit references to slavery and social inequality that appeared in the folk versions they collected. And when Disney finally brought the story to film in 1950, even the Grimm version was considered too dark and violent for modern audiences. Disney's transformation of Cinderella represents the final stage in a process that took thousands of years. The complete sanitization of one of humanity's most brutal historical realities. The Disney version removes all references to systemic exploitation, all acknowledgement of the social conditions that created the need for such stories, and all hint that the problems depicted might require anything more than individual virtue and magical intervention to solve. In Disney's version, Cinderella's suffering is temporary and ultimately serves a moral purpose. It demonstrates her virtue and worthiness for reward. There is no acknowledgement that millions of real children lived and died in conditions far worse than what Disney's Cinderella experiences, and that for the vast majority of them, there was no magical rescue, no prince, and no happy ending. This sanitization process reveals something disturbing about how modern societies deal with historical trauma. Rather than confronting the realities of systems like domestic slavery that continued well into the modern era, we've transformed the stories that documented those realities into harmless entertainment that actually obscures the very conditions it originally described. The real tragedy of Cinderella isn't that a young woman had to clean floors and tend fires. The real tragedy is that we've taken a story that once served as a testimony to the suffering of millions of enslaved children and turned it into a fantasy that encourages modern audiences to believe that systemic problems can be solved through individual virtue and magical thinking. Today, more than 10 million children worldwide are trapped in domestic slavery, forced to work in homes where they face abuse and exploitation and conditions that would be immediately recognizable to audiences of the original Cinderella stories. But instead of stories that acknowledge this reality and encourage action to address it, we tell our children sanitized fairy tales that suggest such problems are ancient history and that anyone in difficult circumstances just needs to be patient and virtuous until their fairy godmother arrives. The censored truth about Cinderella is that it was never a story about dreams coming true. It was a story about survival in a world that treated children as property. And by turning it into a harmless fairy tale, we've lost not just an important historical document, but also a tool that once helped people understand and cope with some of humanity's darkest realities. If that disturbed you, wait until you hear the truth behind Snow White, a story that Walt Disney himself called too dark to tell accurately. Click here to discover why this beloved fairy tale was originally about necromancy, ancient death cults, and ritual cannibalism.